Thank you, Asia Society, for hosting this event tonight. I'm very thrilled to be here and to talk to you. I've learned so much about Chinese art from this institution and from the groundbreaking shows that they've done, starting with the show Inside Out, New Art from China in 1998, which was really my first introduction to Chinese contemporary art and gave me the opportunity to start interviewing Chinese artists and write about them at that time. And with the older generation, the generation that emerged in the 1990s, who were shown at the Inside Out show, I had really an extreme feeling of cultural difference. These artists were new to the international scene, had grown up in a China that was isolated from the rest of the world. And so what their culture was, they were very proud of their culture, and they explored their culture in their artwork. But very often when they spoke about China and they spoke about Chinese culture, it just left me feeling like I'll never understand this and I'm never going to catch up. And often those artists would say things to me like, "You're not Chinese, so there's a level where you will never get my artwork." And so I thought that this was going to be, I took this on as a challenge to see if I could bridge that gap. And over the years, I got to know many of the leading artists of that generation and published widely on them. And then in 2010, I published my first book on China, The Wild Wild East, An American Art Critic's Adventures in China, which definitely made fun of myself and all the mistakes I made during that time. Rather than present myself as an old China hand, I put myself in the position that many Americans feel the first few times they go to China, that this is a very isolating place, very hard to penetrate, and that the art is very different than what we know from the Western canon, and so is a challenge to get to know better. And that was the way I presented that generation in that book. But when I finished that book in 2010, I felt like I had dealt with the past considerably, and now it was time to look to the future. So I began meeting with young Chinese artists, or at least artists that were young then. Now, by the time I published this book, many of them are married and have children of their own, but at the time I was meeting them around 2011, 2012, they were newly out of art school and just beginning to find their way into the gallery scene. Now, one thing I hope I can communicate tonight is just how much fun I had researching this book. These artists not only opened their studio doors to me, they opened their lives to me. We ate dinner together. We went to a techno concert on the outskirts of Beijing. We went to house parties, and I met their parents on some occasions, and I really got to know them well. And one of the reasons I felt like I had to write this book is I felt like I had to pay them back for all the generosity they gave me in terms of access. I had incredible access, and it was also facilitated by the fact that I had a trio of young translators who were the exact age of the artists, who opened a lot of doors for me and often recommended more artists for me to see. And once the word got out that I was looking at younger generation of artists, people began opening their galleries to me and giving me recommendations of artists to see, and curators would tell me artists that they thought had potential, and artists began telling me about their friends. But I have to say, at the very beginning, when I first announced that this is what I was looking for, I went on a trip that made me feel like there is no hope here at all. One curator said, if you're going to write about young artists, you have to see the young artists at the Sichuan Academy, which is the leading painting academy in China. And so we got on a plane, we went out to Sichuan, to Chongqing, and I spent 3 days going to artist studios from morning to night. And I have to say, I never saw so much bad painting in my life. It was 3 days that I thought, if this is the future of Chinese art, then I better find a different country to start writing about, because it seemed so hopeless. But when I got back to Beijing, other people introduced me to other artists. I began seeing that a lot of the young artists weren't working in painting anymore. They were working in installation and video and new media and computer-generated art. And it was very interesting to see what their take on the world was. Now, when I look at the criteria, when I say young Chinese artists, what did I mean by that? Well, I used the year 1976 as the cutoff point. So all the artists in this book were born after 1976. Why that year? Because that is the year that the Cultural Revolution ended and that Mao died. And all the artists that I had originally interviewed from China, the artists of the 1980s and 90s, had lived through the Cultural Revolution and were very affected by the Cultural Revolution. And this was a period where art making was strictly controlled, where many of the artists I interviewed had been sent to the countryside for re-education, whose families had lost everything, and who had seen an enormous amount of violence growing up. And so that completely framed their work and influenced their work. The young generation that I was looking at, I felt it was very important that they should be born in a post-Mao period, so that they had no connection in their life to the kind of political restrictions of a period like of Mao's authoritarianism and the Cultural Revolution. And instead, what they were was a generation that grew up with the open door policy. So they were the generation that from birth began being exposed to McDonald's and KFC and mobile phones and shopping malls and a China that was replete with Western influences. And this is the background that framed their work and that influences their outlook on life. Now, the other thing that was a very big influence on this generation is the one-child policy. Since almost virtually every artist in this book had no brothers and sisters, they were all products of the one-child policy. And I didn't, when I first started my research, I didn't think this would be that important. But having one child myself, I thought, how big a deal could it be? But every single one of the artists talked to me extensively about the impact of being an only child and that had on their art making and on their lives. Many of them expressed a kind of loneliness and a kind of bitterness about not having siblings, especially since as they aged, their parents aged. And so they were left with the sole responsibility of taking care of not only their parents, but 2 sets of grandparents. And so a lot of focus was on them and a lot of pressure was on them to succeed financially. So many of the artists that I interviewed for this book were picked out in elementary school as having talent at drawing, and so that they were designated that they were going to be artists. And from elementary school, went for private drawing lessons after school and on the weekends, and then went to feeder high schools, to the art academies during their teenage years, and then went to one of the major art academies. And one artist described this to me as the end of her childhood, that it was like that people deciding that she was going to be an artist. It's kind of the way we look at gymnasts or Olympic athletes. She said that that was the disaster, that was the end of her childhood. So instead of seeing these artists as spoiled rich kids, I got to see them as very hardworking and very ambitious. And their ambitions are not just about succeeding financially. Their ambitions are about making an impact globally. Now, the stereotype of this young generation is that they're spoiled brats, or the phrase for them in China is little emperors. And in fact, even about the differences, the older generation of artists often deride this younger generation as being less political than they were or less engaged with social issues. But I found that these artists were barely spoiled brats. They were really working very, very hard. In fact, often I would come back from trips to China and tell my students at SVA, you better watch out, because this is not a generation worrying about their tattoos. This is a generation that's in the studio making substantial artworks. But also, I found that there was a lot of resistance in their work, that often they were critical of the lifestyle of China, of the materialistic lifestyle, or of other social conditions, not necessarily pointed at the government, but often pointed at just the economic conditions in China. So, for example, there's this artist, Jojo, who made this work where he fired a gun into mirrors. And Jojo told me privately that this work was inspired by photographs he saw of the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, where bullets had sprayed across the windshields of cars. And so even though the government was denying that any massacre took place, there was evidence just in the pictures of the avenue that something had happened there. And so he was inspired by that to get a gun and shoot at plates of glass and at mirrors. But in China, when he shows this work, he calls it constellations. And he says it's like the stars in the sky. So in China, he's been able to show this work extensively. But when he's outside of China, he talks about the political roots in it. So I've seen a lot of artists working in this way, where the politics are not so pointed and didactic, but more as a metaphor. Now, the major difference I found between the younger generation and the older generation was this issue of Chinese identity. The older generation was very, very involved in expressing a Chinese identity in their work. And even when they did not consciously think that way, curators from outside of China went looking for work that looked Chinese. I mean, I often say about curators in the 90s that they felt like if they made the trek all the way to China, the work better the fuck looked like it came from China. And so at biennials around the world, you'd see artworks that from a mile away you could tell they were made by a Chinese artist. This younger generation, when I was talking to them, really eschewed this category entirely. They often said to me, don't call me a Chinese artist. Don't describe me as a Chinese artist. I'm a global artist. That is the way I want to be seen. So whereas an older generation, it was very important for me to recognize them as a Chinese artist, the younger generation was very much looking at themselves in terms of a global landscape. And so the phrase I came up with in the book was not post-Chinese, because they were still very Chinese, but post-passport, and that they had a post-passport identity. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, here's me and my passport. And there's a few things you get from the passport, but mainly what you get emphasized over and over again is place of birth and national identity. What I found with the younger generation is, though they were proud of being Chinese, they weren't going to let their passports define them. And even though, obviously, dealing with passports is still endemic to having any kind of international career. I need a visa to go to China. These artists need a visa to come to America. They have aspirations for a life where they're not bound by such things as visas and national boundaries. Now, the traditional approach to identity, which was really evidenced in the artists of the 80s and 90s, were very binary and not fluid at all. So often it would be, if we talked about biological identity, it would be gender often expressed as male versus female, or cultural nationality or native language, or historical, which assumed a shared experience, or genealogical, family ties. And I found that the artists of the 80s and 90s made work about all of those things. So you have an artist like Jojo Gong, which is probably in America, the most well-known image of Chinese contemporary art. And this image was the bane of my existence, I have to say, because whenever I wrote an article on Chinese contemporary artists, the photo editor said, we need this image. It didn't matter which artist I wrote about. I could write about Ai Weiwei, I could write about Saiko Chung, but the photo editor would say, this is the image we need for the cover of the magazine. So I couldn't get away from this image. So when I met Jojo Gong, and I've met him many times, but he was gracious enough to let me interview him for the book, I talked to him about how he came up with this image. And he said that what happened to him in the 1990s was that he had made a trip to Germany and realized that he was going to get nowhere as an artist trying to imitate Western artists, that he was going to have to come up with something authentically Chinese to make a mark in the world. And so he was looking through old family albums and was inspired by pictures from the Cultural Revolution to begin making this series of paintings, the Bloodline series. But he felt that he did not have any responsibility for how widely these images were shown, and was a little, he was like, that's not what I set out to do. But in terms of expressing his own identity, that was very important to him. Or we look at this work by Lin Tian Mao. I hope you can see it on this image, but it's a large portrait of her face, and going through the fabric are hundreds and hundreds of knots of threads, and going out through the back of the fabric is a long braid from all the threads being braided together. And this has all to do with the history of the braid in China. It has all to do with being a woman in China. And all of her work at the time, even though she doesn't necessarily embrace the term feminism, was often included in global feminist art shows. Or even Saiko Chung with his fireworks. He came up with the idea of making art out of fireworks because fireworks were invented in China. So again, if you're going to do something authentically Chinese, why don't you start with something that is authentic to Chinese experience, like fireworks? And so Saiko Chung's fireworks displays have been seen all over the world. But the image that I thought of when I began writing this book in terms of the old generation and the new generation was this image by Wang Qingsong, Can I Cooperate with You? And in it, you see a Western man arriving in China surrounded by a bevy of young women bearing signs for McDonald's and Coca-Cola. And on the left, scaled down so that they look much smaller in Photoshop, are 3 Chinese citizens waving the Chinese flag in an act of surrendering. And when Wang Qingsong made this image, what he was really talking about is that he felt that with the open door policy and all these products coming into China, China was surrendering to the West, and this was a bad thing. That's what he's trying to convey in this image, that China is giving up its own culture for world culture and for Western culture, and that this would dilute Chinese culture, and he saw this influence as a negative effect. Fast forward 15 years, and you have this work by Xu Zhen, which literally takes the issue of East meets West and stands it on its head by standing the Venus of Milo on the shoulders of a Buddhist statue. Now, Xu Zhen has a big sense of humor. You're allowed to laugh when you look at his artwork. He is kind of the intermediary figure here, because he was born in 1977, so he's just short of missing the Cultural Revolution, but he's very influential on the younger generation. And Xu Zhen, a few years ago, declared himself a corporation. He is now a CEO of a corporation called Made In, and Made In makes all his artworks. So he has a studio, which is a factory outside of Shanghai, with dozens of studio assistants, and on every floor they're making a different kind of artwork. Now, I devote a whole chapter to Xu Zhen in this book because he said the one thing that was really influential on me on my research. He said to me, when I asked him, are you a Chinese artist or a global artist? He said, anybody can be a Chinese artist. All you have to do is take some images of Mao, throw in a dragon or two, maybe a pagoda, and you're a Chinese artist. An American artist can be Jojo Gong. And he said, so I can be whatever kind of artist I want to be. And so he's often made works like this one, which is huge, combining the Parthenon with Buddhist imagery. Or this tapestry, which has all references from Western art history and no references from Chinese art history in this huge tapestry. This tapestry is as big as that wall. So, and it's small size. You may not be able to see the details, but there's the head of Nietzsche. There's the phoenix rising from the ashes. There's Thomas Nash cartoons. And Xu Zhen once went even a step farther. He made a show at his gallery in New York, James Cohan Gallery, called Art from the Middle East. And he had his factory produce artwork as if it was made by a collective of Middle Eastern artists. So there was like styrofoam mosques and work made out of barbed wire and tapestries referring to political cartoons from the Middle East. And I was there, and often people mistook the show for work of a collective from the Middle East and not work of a Chinese artist. And this is the kind of thing that he's purposely trying to do. And here, I don't want you to look at the big statue. To the left of it, this is at a show that he had at the Ulan Center in Beijing. He built an entire supermarket. Now, what it was filled with were empty products. It was just the packaging. But he had his studio reproduce all the packaging of products you would find in Beijing supermarkets. And he had two studio assistants manning cash registers. So at the opening, people could go and buy an empty carton of milk, an empty box of cigarettes, an empty Tide detergent. And people were happily buying this. And he turned the whole idea of an opening into the idea of a shopping mall, which is one of the things he's trying to do continuously, is just confuse you. Instead of being the serious Chinese artist, like the artists of the 1990s, he is making fun of the whole thing. And finally, this painting, which is the cover of my book, he has studio assistant upon studio assistant all day long filling pastry bags with oil paint and squirting florets over and over again on canvases. And he's made dozens of these paintings, and this is the cover of my book. Now, with the younger generation, I found that there were totally different approaches to identity. And I found that there were three approaches that I saw in this work. One was sampling, artists acting like DJs, sampling different cultures from around the world and mixing it together the way a DJ would mix music. Or technology. Technology has a huge impact on this generation's notion of identity, and I'll go into that more in a minute. And finally, fabrications, fake identities, false narratives, artists making up characters or pretending that they are different characters and making artworks based on fictional stories and fictional exhibition contexts. So for sampling, there were three artists that I looked at: Chen Zhou, Guan Xiao, and Chou Xiaofei. And each of them are exploring this notion of sampling in different ways. So Chou Xiaofei is an oil painter, and he is the one who first said to me when I asked him how he got his ideas, was he influenced by Western art history or Chinese art history? And he said, I'm operating just like a DJ. I have techno music going in my studio, and all day long, I'm just taking forms and ideas from different cultures, and it doesn't matter to me whether I am loyal to any specific tradition. So when I first met him, he had made this painting, Utopia, which is a depiction of Beijing in the year 2008, just when the city was being reconstructed and redeveloped for the Olympics. And indeed, it was a city entirely torn up. And in the middle of the canvas, you see a statue with an outstretched arm. And this is a reference to all the Mao statues that you find around China, only this one is headless. So this is the way he was working in 2008. But by 7 years later, he was working much more abstractly. So you see the figure, you still see the figure, it's the orange figure in the middle, and you still see the chaotic landscape around them, but everything's being done in a much more abstract way. Or this, the companion painting, where now the orange figure is much smaller and the chaotic landscape is all around it. And instead of calling it utopia or referring back to Beijing, he calls it systems of chaos. And this is the way the show looked when he had the show at Pace in 2016. Now, I have to say, one of the things that motivated me while I was writing the book is I wanted to get to the bottom of how you could get from Zhang Xiaogang's paintings of somber-faced people to this painting of balls rolling through the woods. It seemed like it's hard to imagine that it came from the same culture or the same country. But the truth of the matter is, the difference between these generations, the older generation and the younger generation, it's as if they were born in two different countries in two different centuries. That's how big the generation gap is. And Chou Xiaofei also is very influenced by Rauschenberg. He saw a Rauschenberg exhibition in Beijing in the 1990s, I guess, 1986 it was, and he was a child then, and he saw that Rauschenberg exhibition, and it's continued to influence his work. So he often makes assemblages influenced by Rauschenberg. Now, Chen Zhenzhou is an entirely different kind of artist. He went to school in London, and while he was in London, he got the full effect of culture shock. And he immersed himself in subcultures of Europe and the United States. And so what he does is he makes these performances using dozens and dozens of characters, stealing things from various different subcultures. So often he'll have Budo dancing and Tibetan music and techno music and rave culture and Alexander McQueen fashion and the New Romantics all mashed together in one performance. And he makes props for the performance like these. And these performances are long durational performances. They're like operas. They go on for hours. And I have a fantasy about bringing Chen Zhenzhou to Asia Society at some point, because I think whenever I show a video of his work, audiences in the United States always ask me, he can do this work in Beijing? And indeed, he has done this work in Beijing. But they're full of nudity and sexual references, and they really make fun of religion, especially they steal from Buddhism extensively for very non-Buddhist ends. And I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. But he has been doing this in Beijing and all over the world. This is an image from when he did the performance at Palais de Tokyo a few years ago. And finally, there's Guan Shao, who spends her life surfing the internet to look for artifacts from various different civilizations. And Guan Shao often mixes, like in this piece, she has fabrics from African textiles, statues from Maori Polynesian statues, photo stands, and high-tech devices, all pushed together in a single work. This is a detail of it. And she also makes humorous statues out of various different things that she pulls and buys off the internet. This is a part of an installation she did at the Hayward Gallery just a few years ago. The Screaming Woman is from a Beatles concert. And the foot with the shoe and the modernist lamp are all elements in it. She wants you to feel like you're going into a civilization that you don't know the roots of, that you can't pigeonhole, you can't stereotype. And she uses the term universal, which is like really interesting to me because when I started writing on Chinese art in the 1990s, I was among a group of critics that worked very hard never to use the term international or never to use the term universal. We were not to assume that something in New York would have equal importance in someplace else in the world, or that something from China would be interpreted uniformly across the globe. And so I was always very careful to put artwork in the context of the culture. But now with this young generation, they often talk to me about doing things that they feel has universal interpretation and universal values. And so that made me rearrange my thinking a lot while I was talking to them. Here, this is the entirety of the installation at Hayward Gallery. Now, in terms of technology and identity, technology has really influenced this generation enormously. If the artists from the 1990s and 1980s were isolated, this generation is fully exposed to influences from around the world because of the internet. The internet has had a really profound influence on Chinese culture because now these students, they're not relegated to only learning about what their teachers want to teach them. They can go online and find out as much as they want about Western art history. And so often you find a very funny thing where artists have learned all of Western art history from what they've pulled off the internet in non-chronological order, so that they make use of references to Western art history, but it makes no sense in terms of our knowledge of a canon. Or I found that all of the technology that this young generation is exposed to, and I mean everything from iPhones and iPads to new media in their artwork, has really changed their notion of identity. So there's one artist whose work I incredibly admire is this artist, Liu Yang, who, let me put it this way. When I first met Liu Yang, she was living in a fourth-floor walk-up in Shanghai in an old rundown apartment building. So I walk up the 4 flights, and I get to her place, and we're in a really cruddy hallway where people have left wash out to dry, and it's dirty, and it really looks like we're back in China in the 1970s. And I step over her door into her apartment, and we're suddenly in the 21st century. The apartment is filled with computer screens, dissected frogs, brain scans, and she explains to me that she's using the internet to talk to scientists all over the world to learn the latest developments in neuroscience. And so she has done a lot of work juxtaposing religious influences and the latest technology and science together. So, for example, in this animation, 3D animation called Wrathful King Kong Court, she takes a Tibetan god of wrath, a Tibetan god of anger, and she presents him in all his glory. But then she dissects his brain and pinpoints what part of his brain is defective that's making him that angry, and then goes into what psychotropic drugs he would need to take so he wouldn't be such an angry god. And she does this in the course of a 15-minute video that is quite spectacular to look at, but also has a lot of meaning to it in terms of questioning what will become of religion if all that's left of our soul is biochemistry. Or, in terms of identity, she made this piece called Uterus Man, which is a fully operational video game that you can interact with, that the main character is an androgynous figure who looks male, like a male superhero, but all his superpowers is based on female reproductive organs. So he has an electric umbilical cord, and he rides around on a motorized pelvis, and he throws radioactive fetuses at his enemies, and he's able to zap an enemy and change their DNA structure so he can change them from XX to XY chromosomes and defeat them. So, and as I said, you can play this game. For a while, this game was in the lobby of Asia Society last year. But just think about how different that is than the binary way that artists in the 1980s and 1990s thought about identity. Here, she's exploring identity in a much, much more fluid way where what it really means is up for grabs. And finally, she explored her own identity in this animation called Delusional Mandela, in which this is an image of Liu Yang having her brain dissected right before you and having her brain analyzed for you. And then she feeds herself through a 3D printer and makes multiple copies of herself who dance around in the video. And finally, she cremates these replicas and puts herself in a hearse, which is seen driving around the streets of Shanghai. And on the outside of the hearse are all these electronic selfies. And she's really asking what happens to the notion of reincarnation in an age where we have selfies, where after you die, there's still going to be tons of images of yourself left for people to see. And what happens to notions of the soul when we can clone people and reproduce things endlessly? And so she's asking some serious questions, but it's all presented in a really playful, sci-fi manner. And I just came back from Shanghai, where I saw her installation in the Shanghai Biennial, which was a large room, almost as large as this room, filled with animations, video games, 3D models of a UFO landing in the center with aliens coming out of it. And on the video screens were robots using exoskeletons and other robotic prostheses that actually exist today, but she made them look like they were something out of the future. So I'm a big fan of her work. And this is the way one of her installations would look. So she designs the wallpaper and every aspect of the installation. And Miao Ying lives in New York and China. And I love Miao Ying's work because she is directly talking about the internet. But she knows that in the West, we think that the internet is a bad thing in China, which it is kind of a bad thing in China. And she knows how much censorship we hear about. And there is a tremendous amount of censorship on the Chinese internet. Most of the young artists that I work with get a VPN, which is a kind of software that allows you to get around the firewall, the Great Firewall. But Miao Ying has made a body of work examining the creativity she feels is spawned by the Chinese internet. All the way that artists have to, not artists, but everybody invents words to get around the censors or uses GIFs or memes as a way of setting up metaphors that talk about political issues but don't directly point to any political leaders. So she made this online project called Chinternet Plus, which is a big promotional campaign for the internet. The image you're looking at is an image of Mao that never fully downloads and plays over and over again, never fully resolving itself on this website. But she talks about, she uses examples from the Chinese internet and all the different ways that social media is used in China, and totally like a satire of a government propaganda campaign. This is her propaganda campaign for the Chinese internet, telling you not to make fun of the Chinese internet and not to think the Chinese internet's such a bad thing because of all of the stuff that's going on around it. She also, like Guanchao, takes images from the internet and makes 3D installations from them. And in terms of GIFs, she's made a series of GIFs, a series of, computer-based GIFs using images from Chinese dating websites. Again, using something that's endemic to Chinese social media to make new contemporary artworks. So she would say her work is very Chinese, even though it doesn't look Chinese. Like, she would say all of her work is about China. And in fact, this year for Frieze New York, she made this piece where she, merged images of Nicolas Cage and Donald Trump and astronauts. And she said, Chinese artists are always asked what their take is on their political system. And we come to Chinese artists with an expectation that they should be dissidents and they should comment on their political system. And she says, but now I live part-time in the United States, so I'm going to comment on your political system. And finally, I looked at artists who really are exploring fabricating identity. And often they make up a persona and then make artwork based on that persona. So one of them is Tao Wei, who makes videos that are really influenced by soap operas. He grew up watching soap operas with his mother, and Chinese soap operas filled the stations in China. And so he makes work that are over-the-top, emotional, flamboyant, and are based on the storylines of Chinese soap operas. So he made this piece called All About the Body, in which he dressed himself as a Muslim woman and talked about his body to a group of people gathered around him in the bedroom as if he is a woman. And he goes through all of his feelings of self-loathing and discomfort and wanting to be more comfortable with his sexuality, and he's doing it as a woman. Or in this installation, he piped into the room the story of the voice of a woman talking about why she committed suicide, like a posthumous voice. And all the artifacts in the room are things that refer to this terrible life she's had. And again, instead of picking a persona that's closer to who he is, he picks a persona out of soap operas and makes the artwork and the artifacts like as if they're her possessions. And finally, he made this piece, Hello Finale, where this is the installation of it. It was a series of monitors and seating arrangements. And on each video, on each monitor played a video which was allegedly the person's last phone call of their life. What would be the last phone call you would make if you knew you were about to commit suicide? And so there's a range from a schoolboy who's being bullied to an old man who misses his wife, all very stereotypic cliches, but very heartfelt at the same time. So you find yourself thinking, this is a cliche. Why am I so moved by this? And you're moved by it at the same time. And then finally, the final artist that is working in fabrication that I want to share with you is Yanxing, who lives in Los Angeles and Beijing. And Yanxing has really taken this the whole way. He is, really insulted if you called him a Chinese artist. He's had big fights with curators about not calling him a Chinese artist. To him, cultural identity does not matter at all, and he doesn't want you to approach his work through the prism of cultural identity. So, for example, he made this installation, Lenin in 1918, that looks like it's a group show by a group of modernist artists. And if you move in closely, I'm sure you can't see it on this screen, but like the photographs and many of the sculptures have homosexual underpinnings to them. And so they're homoerotic images in it, which is the only expression of himself in this work. But he wants you to feel, he wants people to come in, like the way Xu Zhen wanted people to come in and think that they're seeing art by artists from the Middle East. He wants you to come in and think that this was made by a group of artists, not by an individual artist. And he invents for these kind of exhibitions the curator, the catalog essay, the whole thing is a fabrication. Or for this film, Artie Super Artie, he removed the women from Edward Hopper paintings and filled them with just men in these kind of homoerotic situations. He often uses really minimalist props in his installations, like a handkerchief on a rock and a shoe. Or, again, a man holding a sock. So he'll use minimalism and modernism as a trope in his work. But, like, for example, this exhibition that he did at Kunsthalle Basel last year, called Dangerous Afternoon. So you walked through the galleries and you saw this minimalist work, and you may not have been able to make any meaning out of it. In the final room is a video revealing what it all means. And the video tells the story of a curator, an artist, and the curator's wife. And the curator, according to this video, is a foot fetishist. And he wants to see the artist's feet. And the artist says, you can see my feet if I can sleep with your wife. And the story of this menage a trois is played out in the video. And then you go back through the exhibition and all the artifacts make sense in terms of dealing with shame and guilt and the psychosexual dynamics of the video. And often, Yenxing wants to embarrass you into interpreting his work because, and he has been censored sometime in the West for making things that are too sexually explicit when it's finally revealed. But I asked Yenxing about this piece. I said, so is the curator Western and the artist Asian? And he said, that makes no difference. It's not important whether the curator's Western. It's not important whether the artist is Asian. These are, I'm talking about dynamics that go on between artists and curators all over the world. I'm not trying to pigeonhole it in a specific culture. And in fact, he wrote a long essay for an Asian arts magazine recently where he disavowed using identity at all in interpreting his work. Now, whenever I give this talk, someone from the audience afterwards says to me, but what happened to ink art? What happened to traditional craft? Now, the final artist I'm going to show you tonight is Sood Sunshine, who uses ink and brush painting, but to make fabulous animations. And his work is very political, but it never gets censored because you wouldn't know it because it's very much influenced by George Orwell. So often the politicians in it, the political figures in it are animals or talking megaphones or talking movie cameras. Oh, that's strange. So this is an example of one of his recent animations, Time Vivarium, which is a 4-channel video that all plays together. And it's based on thousands and thousands of ink and brush drawings that he does with a full studio of animators that he works with. So he takes traditional look of ink and brush, but transforms it into something that's a very 21st century type of artwork. Now, in his videos, he often has an image of the magician, which you see in this installation that he did at the Hammer Museum quite a few years ago. And he often says that he uses the magician as the symbol of a politician because magicians are legal liars. We know that they're fooling us. We know they're playing tricks on us, but we buy the ticket and we go to the performance to be entertained. And he said, this is the relationship that people have with politicians. And again, I asked him, so are you saying this about the Chinese government? And he's like, no, I'm saying this about all governments. And when I tried to question him more, it turned out that he knew a lot more about political systems than I did. Because when I asked him, are you for democracy? Would you want democracy to come to China? He was like, yes, but which democracy? And he was totally prepared to debate with me the difference between American democracy and British parliamentary system and the French system and all of these things. And wait, before I get to this, one time he was in New York and there were 2 places he wanted to go to. He wanted to go to the Museum of Natural History and he wanted to go to the Military Museum at West Point. So I took him there. And at the Museum of Natural History, he was enthralled with all the taxonomy. He just loved all of the images of animals and the way that animals are categorized and classified. But when we left the museum, he said to me, that museum is so American. A Chinese natural history museum would never be like this. And that was really interesting to me because basically the only natural history museum that I know in China is the one in Shanghai, and it's really run down and it's still stuck in the 1970s, and it's filled with scientific inaccuracies. So that's my notion of a Chinese natural history museum. But he thought that ours had a very positive spin on science that he felt was very American. Then we went up to West Point, and he was really disappointed that he couldn't get into a class and witness a class. He wanted to see people being prepared for war. But we went through the military museum, and I couldn't believe it. He knew every battle, and that museum starts with the Roman Empire. And he knew all the battles and all the things, and he said this is an influence on all of his work. So when I talk about young Chinese artists being ambitious, I often think of Sun Shun, who really has taken on the world and wants to make a big impact globally. So this is an installation he did at Miami Beach 2 years ago at Art Basel Miami Beach. It was a commission by Audemars Piguet, the Swiss watch company, which sponsors an installation on the beach every year. And for Sun Shun, what he did was he built this pavilion out of bamboo. And mind you, this is for a 5-year period during the art, 5-day period during the art fair, and then it's demolished. So he built this installation. And in it, he filled it with these globes in which 3D animations were playing. And also hundreds of woodcuts, all based on the notion of time, timekeepers. He called it Time Spy. And after you went through the pavilion, you walked out onto the back, and there was a 3D film playing called Time Spy, and which he used woodcuts, 5,000 woodcuts, to make an animation all about the role of, well, it used time as a metaphor. It had flying clocks, it had the magician, it had watchmakers making watches, it had the insides of clocks going. But think of that. He made 5,000 woodcuts in order to make this animation. This is a level of ambition that you rarely see. I mean, I certainly don't see it in my students at SVA, not to make total fun of my students at SVA. But I mean, this is a level of ambition that in which everything is possible, nothing is going to stop you. There are no limits to what you can do. And, Sun Shun now makes his installations all over the world. He just came back from a time in Australia. But I want to end with this image of Sun Shun. So thank you very much.
So, Barbara, thank you so much for that very enlightening talk. I'm sure the audience really learned a lot about the young generation. Your first book in 2010, which was Wild Wild East, an American art critic's adventure in China, was focusing on the older, kind of the 80s and 90s and kind of the emergence of this scene. And, you've attributed this book to a 2011 article that you penned for Art News, and you subsequently organized 2 very great exhibitions. But, you've spent the last half decade looking at very intently at contemporary Chinese art. And I'm wondering if there was some element of what you saw that, compelled you to continue this exploration and this journey.
Oh, yes. I have to explain, I'm not somebody who comes to Chinese contemporary art with a background in Chinese classical art, I know very little about scroll painting, for example, and I'm always in awe of the beauty of them, but I don't know that much about them. But what brought me to China originally, and it's the reason that I really looked at this young generation, is that I looked at China and in terms of its growth over the last 30 years and how rapidly it had changed from an agrarian society to a society of megacities. And I really was curious what it would be like to live in a society that that kind of change took place in. And I thought the artists were the best interpreters of that. And so it was a natural outgrowth of that I would look at this young generation because they grew up with those changes. If they were 30 years old, they had grown up with those extreme changes taking place from their childhood. And so, and I found so many interesting things about that's what kept me going.
And in your first book, you make this, you cite this quote from Wang Qingsong, where you asked him, how did this trajectory happen? Namely, what you're saying, from he grew up in poverty, he ended up being this international art star, and he said, if you define modernism by art movements, that might seem true. But if you define modernism as grand utopian schemes promulgated by totalitarian leaders, then we're at the center of things and you Americans are on the sidelines. I mean, and with that kind of idea of kind of one's place in the nation, I mean, do you find that kind of attitude prevails today with the younger generation of artists?
Okay, with the older generation, well, one thing that's true with both generations is ego. I mean, Chinese artists have no limits to their egos, that is for sure. So when I met the Chinese artists in the 1990s, one thing that struck me was that they were very different than other immigrant artists that I had met. They very much were centered on their own culture and didn't feel like their goal was to assimilate into the West. Their goal was to bring this culture to the West. And so the kind of things that like Wang Qingsong said to me, Sai Kuo-cheng also said things to me that were kind of like, I'm coming from the center of the world.
Sure.
And you don't get that. And that really was a brain teaser for me and a challenge that sparked my curiosity. Today, a younger artist wouldn't say anything like that. They would say, but I see them as leaders in a global art world because they come from the center of globalization. So they wouldn't say that about themselves, but I definitely observe that about them.
I mean, and I think in terms of that, in terms of measuring success, I guess, or their perception of their place in the larger art world and world in general, I mean, how do you see this younger generation defining their identity and their what are their markers for success, would you say?
They want to be successful both in China and also internationally.
But does that mean just monetarily, critically, in terms of collectors and exhibitions, or in that way, or are there other?
I think they care a lot about criticality. They want to be artists that are written about, that have solo shows in their own right, and that if they're in group shows, it's not necessarily group shows of Chinese artists, but international array of artists. But what's really interesting to me is that even if they show extensively abroad, they still want to have a presence in China. They don't want to be like totally import material.
Sure. I mean, and with that being said, do you still think it's very important for artists to go away for school? I mean, many of these artists do go to graduate programs, in Europe and the United States, but I think many also choose to stay now, right?
Of the artists I showed today, only one or two went to graduate school abroad, which is interesting to me. But in the last 3 years, a lot of younger than even the artists that are in my book, are all going to graduate school in the West. And I think that has a lot to do with being aware of the limits of Chinese education because of the internet, and knowing that they need more background.
So in thinking about the pedagogical system in China. I mean, many of the artists that were leaders of the art movements in the 80s and the 90s are now part of the academia, the kind of system in China. And how do you think that their influence has impacted and their experiences both working, primarily internationally, I guess I would say, has impacted their students? And how do you think, conversely, that, the innovations of this younger generation have maybe impacted the more contemporary works of these older artists, if at all?
This is a really good question. It's a really complex question because it's very individual what their influences are and how they react to the influences. Like, for example, one thing I found really interesting is when I interviewed young Chinese artists and I asked them if they were rebelling against the older generation, they all rejected the term rebellion. So I think it may have something to do with what that word is in Chinese, maybe, but they all said that they're not reacting against the older generation. But when you explored it more, it was clear that they were reacting against the older generation. For example, many of them feel like the older generation got too commercial. And that artists like Jojo Gong just kept making the same painting over and over again for 30 years. And they're reacting to that. They want to have a more varied practice. And they want to be able to do certain things that may not seem immediately commercially viable. And, they're very interested in, for example, participating in biennials, which requires very different kind of art than gallery shows. So you see that. But I also see that some members of the older generation, particularly artists who were pioneers in like video art in China, have really looked at what the younger generation is doing, and it's really influencing their imagination about where their careers could go. Because I think for a long time they thought if they were making video art in China, they could not show it internationally. There was no market for it. And now they're seeing younger artists in new media show all over the world, and it's like spawning them to...
It's like opening a whole new horizon for them in a
yeah.
way. Well, maybe going back to your book in particular, I mean, through the course of your research and, obviously through your presentation, you're focusing on a certain group of artists. Can you talk a little bit about the criteria of why you chose these artists and, what kind of commonality, or, kind of your process and how you feel they all fit together, if they do,
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about that. I used 1976 as the cutoff point. But beyond that, I wanted to include artists that were showing regularly, so that I had seen repeatedly their work in exhibition. So, and that overlapped with artists who were being successful. So I wanted to make sure I got the entire group of artists that are now being put forth as representing China at this moment. And so when it came to writing the book, I could write really fluently about their artwork because I had seen their artwork numerous times over the course of the last 6-7 years. But also, I have to say, one of the factors was whether I liked them or not. Like, there were a number of artists who I thought I liked their work, and I went to their studio, and they were drunk, and they were rude, and they said, "What am I doing here?" And they challenged me, but not in interesting ways. And I mean, when it came to writing the book, I had so many artists to choose from that I was like, maybe I won't include that one, No,
I mean that's kind of a perpetual question in terms of evaluating the art in relation to the larger person. I mean, not that it's a criticism at all, but I mean, I think you can't separate. I mean, it's subjective inherently. So, yeah. I think that definitely comes to play.
And also, the artists who opened up their lives to me and gave me more access get more room in the book because I had more to write about.
Sure.
But I have to say, I interviewed well over 100 artists in researching this book, and these were long 3-hour interviews with a translator, and sometimes there were multiple interviews. and the book could not contain all of those interviews.
Sure,
and I didn't want it
course.
to just be a book of interviews. So
Sure.
some people did not get included.
I mean, and in saying that, you made a very narrow selection, do you feel that the artists and the ideas that they're working with are exemplary of the larger kind of phenomena that's going on, or do you find that they have unique voices within a larger scope?
I think they're really indicative. I think that they're indicative of something that's definitely going on. That is a major trend in China. There are still lots of artists working in lots of other ways, but this group of artists are really getting international attention for good reason. Their work is very global in its approach, and that is having a big impact back in China. So I guess you would say they're exemplary.
And how do you feel they're received? I mean, both in terms of the kind of more critical art world and their peers, and kind of more the general public, both in China, and how do you think that reception may differ or have commonalities to how the work is being received, outside of China?
Right. In China, a lot of these artists have huge followings. Like when Liu Yang had her show at M. Woods, I think over 100,000 people showed up, not for the opening, but over the course of a 3-month exhibition. And a huge amount of young people. They just love her work. And I also know that there's a whole generation of young collectors that I write about in the book that are the same age as these artists who are really supporting the work of these artists. So I would say that they have a following, that they're not completely ignored in China at all. But on the other hand, when I go to Chinese museums are always really crowded. There's a lot of people in Chinese museums. And I'm left thinking, what are most of the people here making of the artwork, since they clearly have no background in contemporary art? But they're there. I was at the Shanghai Biennial this week, just 2 weeks ago, and you see school children and old people there. I don't know what they make of the contemporary art, but they go to the exhibitions. So, it's an interesting phenomena happening in China around this.
And, you mentioned this post-passport era, or kind of this, these artists are in a very global moment. I mean, can you expand on that a little bit more, and how you think, your definition of that, I guess, and also how, how that kind of goes back to the work, and what direction you think that's going to go in? Do you think it will continue?
I struggled to come up with a term. I mean, for a long time while I was writing the book, I kept using the phrase post-Chinese, which was sort of influenced by Thelma Golden's use of post-black. But I felt like that was not quite right, because these artists are still very Chinese. Many of them don't speak English, still do all of their interactions in Chinese. Almost all of the artists in the book are still living in China or went back to China after graduate school, which was an interesting thing to see. So I didn't want to say post-Chinese, so I was struggling with a term that would come up with it. And then I realized from talking to artists like Liu Yang and Sood Sunshine and Yanqing that they travel all the time. They are on the road continuously. Mm-hmm. And so I thought of the term post-passport as people who live as if there are no visa requirements, or
there's no borders.
There's no borders. There's no national boundaries. And I think it really applies to some of these artists tremendously.
Well, you mentioned that, the phenomenon of most of these artists staying and, retaining their base in mainland China, or, going abroad maybe for studies, or, for part of their career, but they're always going back. And I wonder, because China has such a history with censorship, or kind of, managing perceptions, I mean, do you find that these artists are encountering censorship, or it's something that can, is a consideration in the kind of work that they're creating, or is, any kind of substantial influence on their work or their careers?
The way they experience censorship is the way that all young people in China experience censorship, which is the internet is a difficult thing to manage and very mind crazy making. And so they would experience censorship much more in terms of the internet, in terms of movies they want to see, in terms of television shows, that type of thing, because those fields are much more censored than contemporary art. Contemporary art is relatively uncensored in China because rich people like it. Mm-hmm. And the government is all about making rich people happy. So if it's in a private gallery, very rarely is a show shut down in a private gallery. In all my years of writing about Chinese art, I have seen very rarely. But what does happen is in museums, every work of art has to be approved by the Ministry of Culture before it's shown in a museum. So a lot of times things get removed before the exhibition even opens. And for most of the artists I talked to, they felt like having your work withdrawn from an exhibition is just part of doing business in China. The protesting it is the farthest thing from their mind. Mm-hmm. Which really surprised me, because I come out of an American experience where if a museum withdrew a work of art, there would be a huge...
Sure, there would be like a major outcry. And,
major outcry, yeah, and a big protest. Whereas in China, people are resigned that that's just the situation. Mm-hmm. So also a lot of self-censorship goes on as well.
Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe the last question that I'll ask before we open the questions to the audience is, from all of this research and through kind of your processing all that you've seen and experienced in, the younger generation in China, where do you see the direction going? I mean, do you think it will continue focusing on technology and identity and this kind of reflection of the society, or do you see a new trend coming that you might want to share with us, or a new direction?
Things happen so fast in China. I have never been able to predict what's going to happen 6 months from now in China. Yeah. I mean, that is the truth of the matter. Every time I show up in China, the whole city is completely different than it was 6 months earlier.
It's very disorienting.
It's very disorienting. So, the last thing I would do is predict things. But I think that we may see some resistance to this global outlook also coming up. Mm-hmm. And some amount of artists that are like wedded to ink painting, or, for example, I saw this show by Liu Yang at Gagosian. Yes. Which is all about ink painting.
It was, just the technique was so traditional, and some of the subject matter as well was very so traditional. Yeah.
So we may see artists following that, especially when one artist has the success of showing at Gagosian. Mm-hmm. So that may happen. But other than that, I really can't predict what's going to happen in China.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for sharing your thoughts. I'd love to open up the floor for questions from the audience, if anybody has any questions. You have one, Patrick. Give him a mic.
I could probably talk loud.
Well, because we are webcasting it, so if you could use the mic, that would be great. Thanks.
Hi, Barbara. Michelle. A quick question. I know, the first and second kind of generation or waves of contemporary artists undeniably were influenced by the market. Their choice of media kind of shifted sometimes. This generation, it seems, the identities of the issues of identity, the issues of critical acclaim seem to be prominent. How are they, if they are, influenced at all by the market, by the commoditizing their work or selling their work? Is it an influence on their choice of medium? We're seeing a lot of new medium, a lot of things that are hard to sell, to be frank.
This is a good question. The market is enormously influential in China. I mean, the Chinese art market is almost as big as the United States art market. and there are far fewer museums to counterbalance the market. So galleries have a lot more influence there than here. But I think that this generation has a much more sophisticated notion of what is saleable. The older generation grew up with no gallery situation whatsoever. There were no galleries in China until 1997, when the government said that this would be legal to do. So that many of these artists had 20 years of their career without having any galleries. And so they had a more conventional notion of what would be saleable in a gallery, because they were influenced by what gallerists showing up in China wanted, which was paintings. Whereas this younger generation have a way more varied view of what could be saleable in a gallery. And so, are super into exploring different mediums in the course of even a single career. So I can't say they're not influenced by the market, but I think that they are confident that they can find a gallery out there to work with them, whatever they're doing. And also, the other really recent phenomenon in China is the amount of museums that are being built. There's like 8 contemporary art museums in Shanghai right now, and these museums need to be filled. So many of these young artists have had multiple museum shows by the time they're 35. So they've been allowed to explore a lot of things, more than an American artist would have.
Yes, in the back.
Hey, Eileen.
Museum thing kind of fascinated me. So if museums are actively censoring work and artists are self-censoring, so what's the status of museums for young artists? I mean, it seems like, now, on your CV it would be very to have work at this institution and that institution. It seems like it would be different in China. And also, what does it mean to have a career in, quote, museumship? It seems like that would be a hard job and maybe not something someone would aspire to being a curator.
Oh, okay. These are both really good, interesting questions. One is, it really depends on the artist. There are certain artists that have shown continuously in not that many good museums, but they're very proud of their museum exhibition record. Whereas most of the artists I showed you today, or a lot of the artists in the book, have a much more sophisticated notion of museums because they're showing also in museums abroad. And so they're wary of dealing with a Chinese museum. And they would do it only in circumstances where they're fully funded and it's a good situation for them. Whereas a lot of artists are willing to rent a gallery and put up money to have a show in a museum where they put up most of the money for the exhibition just to say they have a museum show, and yet those type of museum shows don't carry with them that much credibility. The other thing is that there are very few programs training curators in China. And it's really hard to find young people who want to go work in Chinese museums. So a lot of these new museums have no infrastructure and rely on guest curators. So that's why I've gotten to curate shows in Chinese museums. And this is kind of, I think it's a disastrous situation. I think it's a really unhealthy situation. For example, if I want to research an American artist, all I have to do is go over to the Whitney, and they have copious files for me to look through, and archives, and I can go to the estate of the artist, and I can get the archives of the artist. In China, if you want to research an artist's overall body of work, good luck to you, because there is not one museum that is doing that. So the museum situation is really precarious there.
In terms of that kind of archival resources, what's the situation with the Asian Art Archive, AAA? And also
the
another
Asian Art Archive is very good, but it's very small. So the kind of files you would find, let's say, at MoMA's library, if you looked up Jester Johns, you won't find that for Jojo Gong at Asian Art Archive. You're not going to find anything comparable to that.
And I have a second question, which is, Do you come across as many aspiring young curators as there are aspiring young artists in China? And what is the level of understanding on the role of curators in China?
I don't meet as many young aspiring curators by any means. Most of the students that I meet going to a curatorial program want to work at the auction houses, not at the museums. The museums pay not very well, and you can have a much bigger career at an auction house. The same is true for, there's now a group of young critics that are emerging that are very interesting to me, and I'm trying to get more of their work translated. But so you see a small group of curators and a small group of critics developing, but it's still not a strong, healthy situation.
Well, I think we should conclude the Q&A portion so people have a chance to speak with Barbara at the book table. But please join me in thanking Barbara for her time and her expertise this evening. Thank you all for coming. And have a wonderful evening. Please join Barbara at the book signing table and take an opportunity to ask her your questions individually. Thank you.